Hello, everyone. So I guess they saved the lawyers for the last part of the conversation for the presentation today because they know that we would keep you on your toes. So before I get into the meat of my presentation, let me just begin by saying, pardon me for I'm about to speak French, because coronavirus is a force majeure event. Force majeure, and this is really why we write contracts to try to address things like this. Force majeure is not something from Latin, it's not from common law, but it's something we put in our contracts because we know there's going to be sometimes unforeseeable events that are going to make it impossible or more likely for us to prove impractical or impractical and not practical to perform. So when you're in that situation, you need to show that it was, one, not contemplated, and that it caused your delay. Typically, when we look at our contracts, you are usually able to get time, an adjustment and remedy for additional time to address the delays. And this started with coronavirus with delays in the supply chain. The $64,000 question is going to be, will you be able to get money for this? Now, one of the things that you want to do when you're looking at this, the first thing to do is you need to read the contract. One of the things I like to say when you're a general contractor, you can't say the word general contractor without saying the word contract. So one of the things you want to do is look at what the standard contracts. Maybe you are working under a standard construction contract. The American Institute of Architects, A201, the AIA A201, has a provision. It doesn't say force majeure, but there is a delay clause at 8.3, which would give you a time extension for things beyond your control, ... as determined by the architect. So you need to give notice, and you need to make sure that that notice, the reason for the delay, is approved by the architect. And so what you need to do is, again, to give timely notice, and we're going to jump into that a little bit second. Now on consensus stacks is a coalition effort that includes 40 groups, that certainly includes AGC. And we also, that's what I do every day, is work on consensus stocks. We specifically mention epidemics in the provision that is on your screen at 6.3. It also mentions adverse governmental actions. Having the word epidemics or pandemics or quarantines in your force majeure provision is going to be a lot better for you to demonstrate that what we're going through now is a cause for your delay. In certain states, like I've read some case law in New York, you may be prevented from pointing to a force majeure clause if you don't specifically have something like epidemics and pandemics. So if I were in New York, I wouldn't want to be working under an AIA contract document provisions. I'd much rather have the consensus docs. And that's one of the things when we look forward to reviewing your contracts, you want to make sure that you review your force majeure clause. Usually I reserve my speaking French when I am commenting on the AIA documents. Now, what do we want to do proactively here? Because that's really what we want to give you practical advice. Well, you got to give notice. Kevin mentioned that we have a COVID-19 website. I just yesterday put on a great sample notice letter, because you want to give prompt notice, because if you don't, you may lose your contractual remedies. But if you put too much in that notice, you might box yourself in. So you want to give the notice, you want to give it in writing, but the facts on the grounds are changing so much. For instance, with all the government shutdowns, you might have said, well, I am delayed because of a force majeure event because my supply chain is backed up. Well, now if the government stops work on your site because of an adverse government action, maybe you've boxed yourself in. So the sample letter, which is at the bottom of the page under contracts, contract information, gives you some great sample language to consider. So the other thing is, what you want to do is you want to be able to record facts that you're documenting as to how much the delay is and what are the costs involved. Those are things that you might not have to give immediately, but it's something that you and your field folks want to start organizing and recording. Now, going forward, I want you to look at your contracts and think about this. Force majeure requires an unforeseeable event that is not your fault, right? It's sort of like that little scene from Good Will Hunting where Robin Williams tells him it's not your fault. Well, it also has to be unforeseeable. And in this case, you know what is foreseeable is things like coronavirus. So you need to have a broader force majeure clause going forward, and you want to use other provisions to help proactively address the risk and volatility that we're going to see. One step that you can take is include an escalation clause in your contracts. That's good for the owners too. We're going to have a lot of volatility. You don't want the owners to overpay for materials that you have to price in, and then it turns out that you are able to actually get better prices. So if you have something like the consensus stocks 200.1, that is something that will adjust for indexes that are objective. And what I would suggest to you is to consider other, modifying that to include potentially labor costs. Now, I'm going to hand it back to Steve in a second, but I will tell you that there are much more contractual and construction law issues that you want to include to consider, such as your emergency and safety provision. You might want to be looking at what if the owner suspends for 30 days? What if you look at your change of law provisions? These are things that we're going to be able to drill down much more in a webinar series that